Hello and welcome to OTHM Level 7 Diploma in Environmental and Sustainability Management. My name's Emma Honeyford. I'm going to speak about today, we're going to go through Unit 2, Environmental Science and the Energy Transition. So for this unit, this is LO5, so understanding the trilemma of energy transformation and the need for national policies and international cooperation. So I'm just going to go over the learning outcome for today. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in here. So today we're going to understand the trilemma of energy transformation and the need for national policies and international cooperation. I'll explain shortly what the trilemma of energy actually what it entails. So for the learning outcome 5.1, we need to understand how to assess the national and international policies for fostering the designation of renewable energy technologies. So how national and international policies act as a catalyst for the growth of renewable energy, which we will need to reach the ambitious net zero targets for 2050. And we will, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, sorry. So the learning outcome 5.2 is to evaluate what is meant by the trilemma of energy transformation. So what kind of challenges does it present us with? What are the barriers that are going to be a problem in order to get to net zero? And then 5.3, we're going to critically assess the role of international collaboration as an enabler of for energy transformation. So they're all really important matters, and we will cover them shortly. So I'm just going to move across to the slide. So so this is learning outcome 5, understanding the trilemma of energy transformation and the need for national policies and international cooperation. So the indicative content, so we're going to talk around what is the trilemma of energy transformation. So it looks like a triangle, and I'm going to show you a short video in a minute. So it presents us with 3 main issues when we speak about the trilemma of energy transformation. So we've got sustainability, affordability and security. And we're going to talk around why it is important. It's so important for international collaboration and for us to be energy secure. There is different ways in which different countries have gone around energy security, and we'll talk a bit about those attempts and if they what mechanisms they have used and how efficient they were, and then we'll talk around international policies for promoting renewable energies. So the role of international institutions such as the UN and the Paris Agreement and their role in driving the transition. So moving on. So we're going to discuss around learning outcome 5. So understanding the energy trilemma and why national policy and international cooperation are essential. So as we know, energy transformation isn't just about replacing fossil fuels with cleaner alternatives. Every country is juggling 3 competing goals at the same time. So there's issues around energy security, affordability and sustainability, and those challenges will present differently in different countries depending on the main geopolitics at play, and this is known as the energy trilemma. So I'm going to show you a short video which explains this. I've got it all ready. There we go.
Our own energy choices are uniquely personal. They touch every part of our lives. As the world population continues to increase, Demands for energy, including power, heat, cooling, and transportation, are growing with it. Choices may need to be made to balance access and affordability, protecting supply and transitioning to lower emission types of energy. The World Energy Trilemma is a framework designed by the World Energy Council to evaluate countries' ability to provide more sustainable energy based on energy security, energy equity, and environmental sustainability. While these dimensions can work in synergy, there may also be tensions and trade-offs between them. If a country chooses to increase domestic fossil fuel production, it may benefit energy security and possibly affordability, but potentially at the cost of higher emissions. And sourcing energy from a neighboring country may seem a good idea in the short term, but risks the potential for uncertainty down the line if there are geopolitical strains. Renewables such as wind, solar, and hydropower, while competitive and offering lower emissions than fossil fuels, also require investment in supporting infrastructure such as transmission lines and grid upgrades for stability. Building nuclear power plants may address some of the dual concerns of energy security and emissions, but the upfront costs could lead to higher prices, potentially affecting affordability. There is give and take, push and pull, but the aim is to create a balance that meets current needs while building a more sustainable future. When building for the future, the World Energy Trilemma is a guide that countries can take advantage of to potentially create a stronger basis for prosperity and competitiveness, as well as more environmental sustainability.
Okay, so I hope that video has proven to be helpful. But yeah, it's a good kind of framework to understand the main problems that each country will face in terms of energy security, and no country can escape it, and no single solution solves all three problems at once. It will look differently for every country as well. So the challenge is creating an energy system that guarantees reliable supply, keeps prices manageable, and rapidly cuts emissions. So it isn't just about having clean energy. Obviously that is, one of the main goals. We want to be on a path to cutting out fossil fuels. We know the impacts of fossil fuels on the planet. So that is obviously important. But the price has to be accessible, and we have to think about climate equity, energy equity, and ensuring that people, especially those poorer countries, aren't going to be at a disadvantage due to cost. So it has to be the whole, it has to be sustainable, the whole picture. So most countries can make progress on one or two corners of the trilemma, but hitting all these requires long-term planning, coordinated policy, and international cooperation, which we're going to go into a little bit further on, later on. The trilemma becomes obvious when you look at any major energy decision. So, for example, when we build more energy capacity, renewable energy capacity, it will reduce emissions, but it doesn't automatically guarantee grid reliability. So we know there are problems we discussed at one of the previous sessions around intermittent energy, especially when it comes to renewable energy. It isn't always reliable. It can be up and down. So it's about how we then store that. So that's an issue there that we have to think about. So we will need a lot of investment when we're looking at how we store that surplus energy to meet the demands when we don't have when the supply isn't there. So expanding domestic fossil fuel production may improve security, but goes directly against climate commitments. So obviously some countries may still rely heavily on fossil fuels, which obviously is great for them because we need energy. We can't escape that. We do need it, but that will undermine any kind of climate commitments and isn't aligned to the Paris commitment. So, which is to not exceed a temperature above 1.5 degrees. So there has been an increased turn to subsidising consumer energy bills to improve affordability. But then there's an economic cost on governments and the public. So it's about considering all different parts of the triangle. So every choice trades off something, which is why strategic policy frameworks matter. So again, going back to the role of policy as a catalyst for energy security, we're going to go into in a minute a bit more. So this is also why global cooperation is unavoidable. So we know that energy markets, supply chain and climate impacts don't stop at borders. It's one planet. We're all connected. We can't break down and keep environmental problems in single countries. There will be an impact from one country to another. So solar panels depend on minerals extracted in one set of countries and manufactured in another. Oil and gas prices are shaped by global events, not national actions. So climate change is driven by cumulative global emissions. So one country's progress can easily be undermined by another's inaction. And this has prevented a lot of countries making firm commitments to international agreements, because they feel, why should we, put ambitious targets in that could help our trajectory towards the net zero path, because they feel, well, another country may undermine all my work, which there is, understandable, but that viewpoint can be a barrier for change also. So agreements like the Paris Accord and international emissions reporting and technology sharing partnerships and cross-border grid connections exist because no country can stabilise its own energy system in isolation. So it just shows the interconnected nature when it comes to the energy trilemma. So we're going to go a bit deeper into this in the next section, but the foundation is straightforward. The energy trilemma explains the competing pressures shaping every energy decision. So we know that we will need system level thinking. We can't just think about one dimension of the energy trilemma triangle alone. We have to understand the interconnectedness of those three different areas of security, affordability and sustainability. So I'm just going to catch on here, sorry. So the energy trilemma explains the competing pressures shaping every energy decision, and effective national policy plus international cooperation are what make a balanced long-term transformation possible. So we will rely heavily on international cooperation, and that is, we've seen that at the many COPs. So we know that at COP28 in Dubai, countries agreed to first of all triple their global emissions, their global renewable energy by 2030. So we know that that's only 5 years away. Another one of the agreements was to double the global rate of energy efficiency by 2030. So that is another international policy that will help drive this. Okay, I'm going to move on. So for 5.1, we're going to assess the national and international policies for fostering the dissemination of renewable energy technologies. So we know that policies are the reason renewables went from expensively niche technology to the cheapest. So we understand the role of policies as an instrument to drive renewable energy demand across the world. So it is a great way to drive this, to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. So markets on their own would not have delivered the scale and speed of deployment we've seen. So we know we can't solely rely on market forces. We need governments and policy creation by national and international governments to work in cooperation with economies to drive the change. So national and international policies both try to solve the same problems. So high upfront costs, investment risk, grid integration and unequal access to finance. So this problem with certain countries unable to finance the green transition has been a problem and has been seen as inaccessible to a lot of countries. So that is a barrier. So whilst some have worked quite well in some countries, others have faced problems and it has been politically fragile. So, that then kind of takes us back to ideas about climate justice. And we know that one of the Sustainable Development Goals are set out by the UN. There are 17 goals. One of those is the Sustainable Goal 7, which alludes to everybody's right for affordable and clean energy. So that's that connection there and something to be aware of. So we're going to now break down the national and international policy and then give a critical assessment. Okay, so here we've got different ways that different governments have addressed sorry, something's just disappeared. Okay, yeah, so there's several ways in which governments have used policy to drive renewable energy security. So some countries have looked at using feed-in tariffs. I'm going to show you a short video now. There we go. Zoom out.
We will talk about feed-in tariff, FIT, and how it promotes investment in renewable energy sources. A feed-in tariff is a policy tool designed to promote investment in renewable energy sources. It means promising small-scale producers of the energy, such as solar or wind energy, an above-market price for what they deliver to the grid. Feed-in tariffs are seen as necessary to promote renewable energy sources in the early stages of their development, when production is often not economically feasible. They usually involve long-term agreements and prices tied to the cost of production of the energy in question. The long-term contracts and guaranteed prices shelter producers from some of the risks inherent in renewable energy production, encouraging investment and development. Anyone who produces renewable energy is eligible for a feed-in tariff, but those who take advantage of it are often not commercial energy producers. They can include homeowners, business owners, farmers, and private investors. Generally, FITs have 3 provisions. The U.S. was a pioneer in feed-in tariffs, with the first implemented by the Carter administration in 1978 in response to the energy crisis of the 1970s. Known as the National Energy Act, the FIT was meant to promote energy conservation along with the development of renewable energy such as solar and wind power. FITs have become widely used internationally, with countries like Japan, Germany, and China using them successfully over the past decade. It is estimated that about 3/4 of global solar energy is linked to feed-in tariffs. Despite the successful role feed-in tariffs have played in promoting the development of renewable energy, some countries are turning away from relying on them. Nonetheless, FITs still play a vital role in the development of renewable energy resources around the globe. Here are 3 key takeaways. 1. A feed-in tariff, FIT, is a policy designed to support the development of renewable energy sources by providing a guaranteed, above-market price for producers. 2. FITs usually involve long-term contracts, from 15 to 20 years. 3. FITs are common in the US and around the world, used most notably in Germany and Japan. Hope this would help. Thanks for watching.
There we go, we don't want that. Sorry. Okay, so moving on. So with feed-in tariffs, they're a guarantee a fixed price per kilowatt energy. So it gives people the assurance that they're going to get they're going to get their investment back. And yeah, so there's different kind of mechanisms that different countries have looked at. So we've got feed-in tariffs, auctions and contracts for difference. So these have been used. The UK has used this instrument before. and it's been central, in cutting offshore wind costs and deploying record capacity. And the government continues to use this form of instrument to accelerate the development of wind power. So there are two different types of instruments there. I'm not going to go into every single one of those. And then we have C, so we have tax incentives and subsidies. So the US has used tax credits as its main lever. An analysis suggests these credits are driving hundreds of billions in new clean energy investment and substantial emissions cuts over the next decade. And then we've got the D, renewable targets, grid rules and planning. So a lot of countries now have been really explicit about the renewable energy targets in law or strategy. So you've got the IRENA, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency. So this is a global intergovernmental agency. So that it's basically a platform for international cooperation, and it supports countries in their energy transition. The ARENA notes that nearly every country has some form of renewable target, and that policy support plus innovation and competition has driven cost deadlines and deployment globally. So within the EU, for example, it has a binding 2030 climate and energy target, including higher renewable shares. So there's more pressure on countries now within Europe to drive renewable energy because of the targets. And with integrated planning and reporting rules to align national policies with the Paris Agreement. So national policies have a massive role to play in driving the energy transition. So supporting measures like priority or guaranteed grid access are essential to actually getting projects built, not just announced. So an assessment of this. So targets and grid rules are necessary, but not sufficient. They send direction and create accountability, but without strong financial instruments and planning reform, they risk becoming empty promises. So back over to the tax incentives and subsidies. So with the US, we know that these tax credits have driven a lot of investment in clean, green energy, which has meant there will be substantial emission cuts over the next decade. So this has been, for an assessment of this, the strength has been massive scale, long-term visibility, so companies can plan multi-year pipelines due to the foresight, the long foresight in the future, so they can make that plan ahead. So it's seen as being more safe and sustainable that way. So a weakness, the complex compliance rules and political risk. And proposed rollbacks in Congress. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes with the Trump administration, so that has impacts there. So that is potentially a risk for a lot of companies who have invested in this. So tax incentives work, but they're vulnerable to political swings and design complexity. So there is a political sensitive nature of all of this as well. So, okay, now we're going to move on to the international policies and cooperation. So the Paris Agreement and nationally determined contributions, the NDCs. So the Paris Agreement provides the global framework. So all countries are working to the Paris Agreement, and it commits all parties to progressively put actions in place, climate action plans in place every 5 years. So they are required. So renewables are now deeply embedded in NDCs, and one IRENA analysis found that 90% of submitted NDCs mention renewables, and around 70% of those plans included quantified renewable energy targets, so that is positive. So an assessment of this instrument is that the Paris Agreement doesn't mandate specific policies, but it drives national strategies and underpins domestic laws, like the EU's 2030 package, net zero laws and clean energy plans. So it doesn't give a specific roadmap of how countries should get to aligning goals to not go over 1.5 degrees, but it has seen countries kind of create their own roadmaps, so that is positive. So it creates a shared signal for investors that clean energy is not a fad, it's a direction of travel. So it makes good business sense now to invest in green energy. So a weakness, enforcement is soft, so delivery depends on domestic politics and capacity. So we know that for those countries that haven't been submitting their 5-year plans, there isn't anything in place in terms of kind of financial penalties. So that is a potential flaw. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more. It won't allow me to for some reason. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the International Renewable Energy Agency and other bodies, so the IRENA acts as a global platform for cooperation, policy advice and data on renewables. So it is an international body that does intend to help countries to get to their renewable goals. So it does support countries in designing enabling policy frameworks and analyses barriers and policy options for scaling renewables. So the recent IRENA work explicitly focuses on what policies and regulations are needed to triple renewable power and double energy efficiency by 2030, including coordinated finance and technology deployment. So obviously we need to be able to finance this. It's going to cost a lot of money. So it's how do we get the investment? So yeah, they are a helpful agency. So an assessment of this, so the strength is knowledge sharing, best practice, policy design and technical assistance. A weakness, it has no enforcement power again, similar to the Paris Agreement. Its effectiveness depends on member states actually using the guidance, don't have to. And then we have C, climate finance mechanisms, so we have the Green Climate Fund and others. So scaling renewables in developing countries is constrained by capital cost and risk. The Green Climate Fund and Multilateral Development banks co-finance large mitigation projects, such as the renewable generation and grid upgrades. The IRENA and others frame climate finance and de-risking tools as essential enablers to scale renewables in emerging economies. So an assessment of this mechanism would be that it reduces the cost of capital, unlocks private investment and helps countries leapfrog straight to renewables instead of new coal or gas. So that is a barrier to that kind of transition to renewable energy can be a lack of technology, a lack of money for that investment in the green technology. So this, the Green Climate Fund has enabled the gap to be filled there. So the weaknesses, the finance is far below what's needed, so it's not enough, and access is often complex and bureaucratic. Okay, so we're going to do an overall assessment now of those different mechanisms. So we know that national policy does work. We've got the FITs, auctions, tax credits and binding targets and grid rules, and they have dramatically increased renewable deployment and cut costs. So Germany's FIT and the UK's CFDs and the US IRA are all strong examples, each with their own flaws but undeniable impact. So countries have different ways of getting there, and it's just important to understand that. So policy stability matters more than the exact instrument. So when the rules change suddenly or incentives are threatened, projects can be cancelled and investment stalls. So we've seen this recently with the recent US clean energy cancellations driven by uncertainty over future tax credits. So the political landscape has implications for the energy transition. So international frameworks set direction but don't guarantee delivery. The Paris, IRENA and climate finance mechanisms create shared goals, support and money flows, but the actual deployment still hinges on national politics, institutions and grid capacity. So we need international cooperation, we need political cooperation in order to make sure the policy is correct and aligned to the targets. So equity and access remain weak points. While richer countries refine auctions and tax credits, many poorer states struggle to access climate finance and build the institutional capacity needed to implement renewables at scale. So there's this thing around climate equity. It's going to be easier for some countries than others, and we have to really think about climate justice and how equitable this transition looks like. And we need to obviously have an understanding that for some countries that don't have access to finance to invest in green technology, we may need to offer them some support. So national and international policies have clearly fostered the dissemination of renewable technologies, but the job is far from done. The next phase is less about inventing new policy tools and more about scaling, stabilising and globalising the ones that already work, while closing the financing capacity gaps that still hold back a lot of the global south. Okay, so 5.2, so we need to evaluate what is the trilemma of the energy transformation. So we know the energy trilemma describes the 3 priorities every country has to balance when transforming its energy system. So we have energy security, energy affordability, and environmental sustainability. So there are 3 dimensions that each country will need to consider when thinking about the transformation to more renewable energy. So the challenge is that improving one area can easily weaken another. So no country can escape this, and the trilemma sufficiently explains why energy transitions are politically complicated, economically uneven, and often slow. So when we break it down, so just to explain energy security, so what is energy security? So energy security is important for life on Earth. Like I've mentioned earlier, the Sustainable Development Goal number 7 is that every human has the right to affordable and clean energy. We know it's important, the United Nations thinks it's important, and that's why it is an SDG goal. So energy security means keeping supplies reliable, resilient and independent. So it's all about energy independence. So that we individual countries can avoid shortages or political pressure. So countries want stable electricity grids. So we need the infrastructure to be good quality and be able to support renewable energy, secure access to fuel or renewable energies, and we need diversified supply chains, and we need protection from global price shocks. So yeah, it's just understanding that, you know, the market forces cannot impact countries' attempts to be more sustainable with energy production. So the problem is that moving away from domestic fossil fuel to imported technology, so solar panels, batteries and turbines, or variable renewables can introduce new vulnerabilities. So this thing around relying on other countries can put them at particular risk, especially if there is any political turbulence. So for example, relying on imported gas improves reliability in the short term, but exposes a country to geopolitical shocks. So if we build large amounts of wind and solar, we can strengthen long-term security, but only if the grid and the storage and supply chains are in place and can keep up. So increasing security is never simple, and it depends on the infrastructure, technology and resilience, not just what type of energy is used. It's ensuring that we have the technology there. Okay, so the next section of the energy trilemma triangle is energy affordability. So this is something countries do have to consider. So this refers to how costly energy is for households. So businesses and governments, and affordability is shaped by the cost of generation, infrastructure investments, subsidies or taxes. So we don't want to put the cost back onto the consumer through tax mechanisms. So the market design has an impact, and the volatility of global fuel prices can massively can impact energy affordability. So fossil fuels have traditionally been cheap because the infrastructure already existed. Renewables require high upfront capital investment, even though they're cheap to operate once built. So it's that kind of idea that to get a kind of piece of clothing, it make a better quality clothing costs more, whereas cheaper clothing will be, if you look at kind of different organisations such as like Primark or Shein, especially Shein, we know, which isn't sustainable, is very, very cheap. So that's why it has taken off and is very popular. So it's just kind of understanding how the market impacts. So governments often have to subsidise renewable energy onto support deployment, which can raise short-term costs for consumers. So in the long term, it may look cheaper, but as consumers, we may wonder, well, actually, this isn't good for our pockets. We can't afford this right now. So that has to be considered as well. So at the same time, sticking with fossil fuels exposes a country to global commodity prices, which can cause sudden spikes. So affordability becomes a balancing act between long-term stability and short-term political risk. Okay, so the last dimension of the energy trilemma triangle is environmental sustainability. So another really important area to consider. So we know sustainability is about reducing emissions, lowering air pollution, and protecting ecosystems. So to align to the Paris Agreement, we need a low carbon energy system, which requires replacing fossil fuels with renewables, cutting overall energy demand, electrifying transport and heating, and investing in storage and grid flexibility, avoiding new forms of ecological damage. So we don't want to introduce a more sustainable energy, but then swap another ecological problem for another. So we have to consider that as well. So the tension is that sustainable solutions often demand high investment upfront. Solar farms take land, wind turbines face planning battles, and large-scale storage requires mining critical minerals, often from other countries. So there is always a environmental cost, but it may look differently depending on what renewable energy it is. So it just needs an understanding of that for each one, for each type of renewable energy. So environmentally sound policies sometimes slow deployment because permitting community acceptance or environmental protection rules, so they need to be considered, those areas. So number 4, so why is it a trilemma and not a simple trade-off? So countries rarely face a straightforward choice between good and bad outcomes. They face 3 competing pressures. So obviously making energy more secure, making energy affordable, and making energy sustainable. So no policy satisfies all 3 things at once, and improving one can strain another. So we know that rapid renewable deployment improves sustainability, so it's better for the planet, reducing reliance on fossil fuels, but it can temporarily raise costs or reduce security if the grid isn't ready. So if the infrastructure isn't there, that will impact energy security. Okay, so how are governments navigating the trilemma? So at the moment, most governments try to balance rather than solve the trilemma by mixing renewables with some dispatchable generation. So we've got this mix, this energy mix of different types of energy. So using storage and smart grid technology to improve reliability, offering targeted subsidies to keep bills stable, planning long-term decarbonisation pathways, and coordinating regionally or internationally to improve energy security. And then we've got the successful transitions are those where policies are stable. So having the political, there's not much political movement. We know that every country is different in terms of where they're at with energy commitments, and where there is energy commitment within policies, we know that it's less of a risk. So it's all a matter of kind of understanding how we need to adjust policies to make sure the trilemma does not become stressed. So an overall evaluation. So the energy trilemma is a really good way to understand and explains why energy transitions are technically possible but are politically difficult, and not only because of politics but also because of technology and financial instruments as well. So every energy decision looks obviously green but does have trade-offs across cost, reliability and sustainability. So countries that ignore one side of the trilemma eventually run into backlash, rising bills, blackouts or stalled climate progress. So this is why it's really important for any country to understand and assess each dimension of the energy triangle, the trilemma triangle, so that you can really begin to have a system-based approach. So those that recognise the tension and manage it pragmatically are more likely to achieve a stable and lasting energy transformation. So when we look to critically assess the role of international collaboration as an enabler for energy transformation, so international collaboration isn't optional in the energy transition. Modern energy systems are globally interconnected through fuel markets, supply chains, finance and technology. So no country, even the most resource rich, can fully decarbonise in isolation. So this just shows and highlights the interconnected nature of the energy transition, and we all need to work together. So collaboration shapes everything from access to critical minerals to stable electricity markets and climate governance. The challenge is that cooperation is often slow, politically fragile and unevenly distributed. So obviously any political friction between countries can stall any kind of progress to the climate target. So this is why it's so important that we have political cooperation. So it's really essential, but its effectiveness depends on the strength of institutions and the willingness of countries to align long-term goals with short-term national interests. So again, if we go back to the definition of sustainable development, so obviously looking after the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future, I always think it's really important to go back to that definition when we're thinking about the energy transition and how countries think about looking at the short-term interests and the long-term goals. So collaboration reduces the cost and risk of adopting new technologies. So sharing technology and best practice amongst the countries will save on cost, and it's better for the planet if we share information and intelligence. So most renewable energies become affordable when countries share research, manufacturing capacity and market scale. So solar PV is the obvious example. So Europe created demand through early subsidies, and then China scaled manufacturing. So each you can see there different parts of the globe have a different role to play, and global prices collapsed as economies of scale kicked in. So the same applies for offshore wind, hydrogen and modern batteries. Why does this matter? So countries get access to technology they couldn't develop alone. The costs fall as global production increases. So going back to kind of how the role of economies in all of this, we know that if the demand is there, the global production increases, therefore the cost falls. So supply chains become deeper and more competitive. A critical view would be that this relies heavily on stable geopolitical relations, and there's a lot of kind of anxiety at the moment from the EU from the EU about dependence on China's solar and battery imports. So the actual manufacturing is with China. In the EU, there isn't that kind of manufacturing capacity, so that puts the EU at quite in a vulnerable position. So when cooperation turns into over-reliance, countries react by introducing protectionist industrial policies, which in turn slow global deployment. Just going to move this over here. So international climate agreements provide shared direction and accountability. So having one kind of international climate agreement means that that countries are working to one global agreement. So whilst the agreements like the Paris Agreement do not dictate national policy, but they create a common framework that forces governments to set targets, disclose emissions and update ambition over time. We don't know how reliable these emissions are when they are disclosed, but it does show it's a positive step because people are being transparent about where they are at in terms of their kind of how much their energy contributes to greenhouse gases, the global greenhouse gases. So without this baseline, many countries would drift or delay action indefinitely. So the benefits of this, it creates long-term policy signals for investors, encourages harmonisation of standards. So we've got like life cycle analysis, carbon accounting and reporting. So having like a standardised methodology to report on carbon emissions means that it's kind of the same level, one standard across the world. So a critical view would be the enforcement mechanism is weak. Countries can miss targets without consequences. And then we have collaboration mobilises finance for countries that cannot fund transitions alone. So developing countries need substantial investment to build renewables, upgrade the grids and phase out fossil fuel systems. We have the international climate finance that helps reduce risk and attract private capital. So we know that mobilising the finance for certain countries has a massive role to play in energy security. We don't want, obviously, some countries to get into debt in a situation where they're in debt. So the value of doing this means that it does reduce borrowing costs for low-income countries, prevents the transition from becoming a rich country privilege. A critical weakness would be that climate finance pledges are routinely unmet. Bureaucracy makes funds slow and difficult to access. So too much funding still flows as loans, increasing debt burdens. And the Global South countries argue the system reinforces dependency rather than empowerment, especially for those countries in the Global South that feel the Western world has exploited their resources, but they now have to pick up the pieces and then be a further kind of indebted to Western countries. So again, it's that idea of climate injustice. So for number 4, cooperation enables secure energy systems and diversified supply chains. So it makes sense that we cooperate across the world to share knowledge, to share best practice and the technological systems. So critical minerals like lithium and rare earth metals are concentrated in only a handful of countries. So international cooperation through trade agreements and joint ventures and resource partnerships reduce the risk of supply disruptions. So the strengths of this avoids overdependence on a single supplier. Facilitate shared standards for responsible mining and recycling. There are environmental impacts of mining, especially in poorer countries. This goes against the whole idea of sustainability, so that's something that has to be considered. Critical concerns for this, so many partnerships are politically motivated rather than development centred. So there's this idea that, there's criticism that some countries may seek out partnerships with underdeveloping or developing countries as a way to exert control politically. And then we have cross-border grid integration boosts renewable reliability. So some regions will have interconnected grids, such as the EU's internal electricity market can balance variable renewable energy more effectively. So obviously Europe is landlocked, which is also helpful. So the geography does matter. So the advantages of grid integration: increases system reliability, enables higher penetrations of wind and solar. The limitations: it requires political trust and strong governance. And the infrastructure takes decades to build and is expensive. But international grid cooperation is one of the most effective enablers, but also is one of the most politically sensitive, because it means that governments are reliant on each other because the grid is spread amongst several different countries. So overall critical assessment of this: so international collaboration is a necessary enabler, not a bonus. It delivers cheaper technologies, shared innovation, more resilient supply chains, and global climate coordination. It works best when economic interests align. It weakens when geopolitical tensions arise. So there'll be this kind of vulnerability around if there's any kind of minerals competition or any trade disputes. It struggles where global governance is voluntary. It fails when climate finance is insufficient or inaccessible. Okay, so that is all for today. So here is a list of all the references that have been used for the slides. Okay, so the plenary, so if the books and journals are on the Moodle for this unit. Any further questions, please email at learnerwork@ukversity.co.uk. And a reminder, the assignment submission is 2 weeks after the completion of the unit and its delivery. Thank you so much. Bye.